excluding commercial entities from using the software. It could be a license that simply says that anyone can use this free of charge, and then you can make them pay for it. But in general, the license just needs to be maintained. I see what Danny ran into a minute ago. So why do we actually care about open source software? Like 96% of applications use open source software, and as it turns out, 57% of all code, like everywhere, is built using open source software. So it's pretty prominent. It's a pretty big part of our ecosystem. It's a pretty big part of like the open source software ecosystem. And so the question is, given that it generates almost $400 billion in value, why is it that we have maybe 1 to 2 maintainers per project who aren't really getting paid anything for their work? And it turns out that the main reason for this is actually money. So this is a bit hard to see, but essentially it shows that about 62% of open source software is self-funded. Most of those people are not getting paid anything for their work. And the remaining portion of people that are working on open source are actually like getting paid by their employer or by someone who really has no stake in the open source software that they're writing. It's really just sort of a sponsorship or benefactor model. And so the types of things that get funded by the employer are not the kinds of things that most people care about in the open source software ecosystem. So something like OpenSSL is never going to have like a single employee working on it, even though that powers such a large portion of the web. And in fact, it's kind of, there's an interesting tragedy and common sense problem here, where the more critical something is in terms of like core infrastructure, this sort of environment, in terms of core infrastructure, the less likely it is to actually get funded by the current mechanisms that people are using here. And this is particularly problematic because there's actually a huge difference in the number of basically people using open source software. In 2001, 208,000 people used SourceForge, not a huge number. Now, 31 million plus people use GitHub. This is like just in terms of downloads, in terms of actual like daily, sort of like 2-week, bi-weekly users. And so it's not a surprise that in large part, most open source maintainers end up getting burned out. Most open source maintainers end up spending a bit of time, maybe 3 years or so, working on a project that's like extremely valuable to the ecosystem. This was Semantic UI, which was a front-end framework. Front-end framework, which was similar to React or Vue.js. And then Jack essentially just said, this was a good effort. I really tried to make this work, but I'm gonna quit because this is not really paying my bills. It's not really actually valuable to me, even though it's valuable to the ecosystem. This is another, again, probably hard to read example, but this is actually OpenSSL proper. How many of you are familiar with Heartbleed in like 2014? Is that a familiar? Yeah, there's a few people in the audience. So like Heartbleed was this critical vulnerability that affected a very large part of the web, caused like $2+ billion in economic damage. And that's because OpenSSL was mostly maintained by like one person. And that person was getting paid nothing and was trying to work a full-time job, which didn't support him doing that. In addition to writing this piece of software that ran the entire like SSL for the web. And actually, as a result, this is being like deprecated, or has been less commonly used as compared to other libraries more recently. But the reason that we have this in the first place is due to 1 or 2 maintainers who were part of this. And so it's funny then that there's all this value, this $400 billion or so, approximately, probably more to be honest, it's probably an underestimate, of value that's going into open source software, and yet most of the people that are working on it are sort of in this condition. This is a more recent one. How many of you are familiar with like event stream? How many of you actually are in like the JavaScript ecosystem or are familiar with like JavaScript, like Node in particular? So there's a library called Event Stream. And Event Stream was essentially heavily dependent upon. And the thing with Event Stream is Dominic Tarr, who was maintaining it at the time, sort of got tired of it. He decided to give it off to another maintainer, someone he didn't know. And that person injected a series of malicious vulnerabilities into the code base, which then resulted in some pretty catastrophic consequences. Now, you can blame Dominic Tarr for this, and you can say, oh, like he should have really checked who he was giving to. But the fact of the matter is that he didn't actually really have anyone to turn to help him maintain this. So he just ended up giving this off to someone who would take it, which was like this random person after trying for like months to get someone to actually help him out. So this is just a sort of anecdote. Got eye turned down here for some reason. I don't know what's up, but he was basically saying like, okay, I worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant. You know, I made the mistake of being too competent. I got promoted to cook. This was like a 50-cent an hour pay rise with like more responsibility, and then kind of makes the comment here that like writing a popular module is like that, but without the pay rise. So it's actually like kind of funny to me that we're sort of, and you know, these are both obviously great like paths, but it turns out that the one that's having this outsized impact on the world that we live in today, for millions of people, billions of people, is just not really getting the same level of support. And so, after being a downer, like let's try and think about how we can solve this problem. And obviously, so I work for a project called Gitcoin. Gitcoin sort of incentivizes open source software. It's not a coin actually, this is important to note. It's very much just a marketplace for people to find developers to work on their projects. And I'm obviously going to be biased in some of the solutions that I provide, but I'm going to try and give a wide range of solutions, including some that we're not personally working on today. But in general, I want to touch on the fact that in this industry and sort of the blockchain ecosystem, and in Ethereum in particular, there's a lot more interest in open source software than there was, you know, 10, 20 years ago in Web 2. So I think that the reason for this is because we actually have the ability to, one, program sort of our values into money, and two, to align incentives between people in sort of the investment side of the ecosystem and the developer side of the ecosystem. And the reason for that is, you know, if you go and fund some core piece of infrastructure in the space, ideally that improves the quality of Ethereum, and ideally that improves your own interest in the ecosystem. And that wasn't really something that happened in Web 2. And so all these projects in Web 3 actually have money for open source software and are open source by default. And that's something that just wasn't the case in Web 2 that I think is really powerful and something we should be like capitalizing on for Web 3. And so, yeah, there's like up to 900 billion in market cap, everyone needs devs, everything is open source, everything is built remote, and that's the standard that sort of led us to this project, which is largely about trying to increase this funnel from user to contributor to maintainer. So, lots of people use open source software, we've already like established that. Not as many of those people actually contribute to open source software, and then even fewer of those people actually maintain it. So it's like, I think the actual stat, I mean, you can go back to the chart that I showed you earlier, but it's like 1.01% of people who are actually core maintainers of a given library versus people who are just like using open source software. And so the question first is, okay, how do we get more users to become contributors? Ideally, you know, that's the starting point. Just getting people aware of the fact that they can give back to open source software that they're already using. And that's where this comes in. This is like largely just a bounty model. So how many of you are familiar with like GrataPay or Bounty Source or similar sorts of projects that they tried a similar model. They tried it in Web 2, and I think the reason they sort of failed was because they didn't have this aligned incentive between the project and the investors. And so this is really fundamentally where we think Gitcoin actually improves. There's sort of just like this very simple flow from a funder who takes a GitHub issue and puts that into our basically website, and then a coder who goes and finds or surfaces issues within like our Explorer. Let's try it again. And so this is just an example of one of the issues. So you've essentially got just some details about like whether the work is being started, and you'll note it's very hard to see here, but like this is a very small dollar amount. It's something that's very granular. It's about $60 worth of work. And the reason this can happen is because people are working on a whole bunch of these at once and finding these issues as they need them. And so because this marketplace is so like kind of granular, it's easy to put up these smaller tasks. and still make them meaningful and valuable to people. And that's actually probably the most valuable for projects, because it's very difficult to find someone who's willing to jump into working on like a core feature or something that's like a huge part of your long-term roadmap or some core piece of technical infrastructure. It's easier to get people started on these smaller issues so that they can get a sense of what your project is about and then start working with you on like this path towards becoming a maintainer. And so today, these are just like some stats. Basically, we've got somewhere in the range of, what's back here, 500 plus funders, 20,000 developers. We launched in November 2017. Usually this would be sort of like a mesh network graph of basically, well actually it's literally a graph of funders to contributors, but it's actually just static right now because we're not on that. But in short, what is going on here? In short, that's sort of how that flow works from the user to contributor in our minds. And then we've got this contributor to maintainer flow. And so that's really where we get into some of the work we've done with grants. And what grants do, this is very challenging apparently, what grants do is basically give you the ability to fund someone on a monthly stipend for their work and give them the opportunity to become sort of a maintainer over a defined period of time before you bring them on and like have them be part of your code base over the long run. And we've actually seen this go really well within certain projects in the Ethereum ecosystem, and we're looking to expand that to other ecosystems as well. We eventually want this to be just a general open source tool. And so to do that, we do need to include things like fiat payments and so forth. Eventually, we hope that ETH will simply be the default payment mechanism, but we're still working towards that. So this is just one example of the sort of matching funding we did, which is based on this paper that Vitalik, Zoe, and Glenn put out last year. In short, what this paper says is, hey, like quadratic funding or quadratic voting or quadratic mechanisms are interesting. Let's take that and apply it to open source software funding, or just generally to tragedy of commons type problems in order to democratize funding and to allow people to have more of a say in how these common goods are actually funded by like a given pool of capital. And so a good example is just like, if two people were to donate $4, the matching amount would be the square root of 4 plus the square root of 4 all squared. Some of those squared, 16, and then similarly, if you had 8 people donating $1 each, the matching amount would be 64, and you'll see that like, I think I actually have a chart here, even though the total amount of funding has stayed the same, the actual matching amount has grown quite a bit. And the point of that is, even though people are donating the same, or even like, you know, even if the matching amount is the same across the board, if more people are involved in the discussion, if it's more democratic, then there should be more funding available for that project. And so we've done a few rounds of this. These are some of the projects that have received the most funding to date: Prismatic Labs, Walnut DAO, Uniswap, Lone Star, and a few others. This is our second round, which had actually the ProgPow audit funded, regardless of what you think of that. Hopper, Prismatic Labs again, Plasma Group, and a few others. And we just finished a third round, which actually had about 250,000 in total donated to open source from about 2,000 different contributors. We haven't formally compiled the results of that round as yet, but we should have some results in the coming weeks on our blog and on our site for you all to take a look at. But a lot of the models I've talked about here are patronage models, meaning that like we need people to give us money. It's like philanthropic for this to actually succeed. So how do we go past that? How do we actually get people to do something more than just giving money out of the goodness of their hearts? I talked a bit about aligned incentives. I think that like that helps. I think that that means more people will donate, but effectively they are still sort of donating, and you know it's not quite a sustainable model. And so a few options here, which are increasingly controversial, are inflation funding models. This is like, regardless of what you think of it, just an interesting model for how we might be able to fund base level development. This is something that Zcash does, that a few other chains do very well. And this was one that was proposed by one of our co-founders, Ken Nowaki. EIP 1789 for inflation funding. You can find the EIP on standard Pete's repo, and it goes into a lot of detail about why basically a block reward of some kind going to developers or a developer fund might be of interest. Similarly, we have, I don't know if I want to click this again, or, yeah, there we go, okay. EIP 2025, which is very much in the same vein, but for 1.x. I won't go into too much detail there. And then we have support contracts. So for us, BookDJ runs about 100 different NPM packages. And in total, I think they have somewhere in the range of 100 million downloads per month. And he decided, okay, so like even he's actually not able to get funding for his work in a sustainable fashion, which is pretty wild, just given how many people are using his work. And so he said, okay, I'm going to put up a support contract and just offer consulting, offer support, offer even sort of promotion of my repo. And this is sort of an experiment that he's running in order to try and understand where the market lies in terms of like enterprise support or like corporate patronage in a sense. Now the problem with this goes back to what I mentioned sort of at the beginning, which is like a lot of these funders aren't really concerned with like large pieces of open source infrastructure that powers the web. They're concerned with like Docker or like individual pieces of software that they use in their companies, which is totally fine. But it's not sustainable. Like it doesn't provide us with a way to get these larger, like more core pieces of infrastructure funded. And actually, this is a very interesting experiment that Firas ran just after his support contract experiment, which is advertising in terminal. This got some backlash. But he basically decided, look, if people aren't gonna like fund my work, let's just put an advertisement while you're doing your NPM install, and let's just see how people react to it, which it turns out really poorly. But basically, this was a good experiment in like an advertising type model. And I do think there's something here. I don't think advertising is like explicitly bad. I think that the way that advertising has been done historically is bad. We shouldn't have the same level of tracking or the same level of sort of interference in advertising, but I think there's a level at which it can be still valuable. And so I'm biased in saying that, of course, because we do actually have one of these like as our sort of models we're trying. This advertising model is essentially an ethical advertising model that works ideally both on GitHub repos, on READMEs, and on various sites across the web like CodePen or JSBin and so forth, where developer-focused sites that are already whitelisted, that are well-known, can use this to essentially fund, or like basically fund their development, fund their work through advertisements from other development-centric companies and not from just like some random spam company, which is what you'll usually end up getting because they'll pay the most if you're to use something like AdWords, for example. Yeah, or like actually, sorry, DoubleClick. And so this is actually extremely, I think, important to have like a discussion around ethical advertising. It's not really the topic of my talk, so I'll leave that all for someone else to like go into. But I do think that thinking about this model for open source funding is extremely interesting. And so those are just a few models. That's like kind of where I wanted to end this discussion, with just like a survey of the landscape of like what sort of we're working on. But I wanted to leave some time for people to ask questions just about like either their own open source projects or about open source funding generally, and to get a sense of how people are thinking about this problem in this room. So I'll open up for questions now, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, so does anyone have questions? No?
Hello. I'm quite interested in the Uniswap project, and I wonder how it started in the Gitcoin project, and how people contribute to the project on Gitcoin, and how do they develop Uniswap especially?
Yeah, so Uniswap, like Hayden really just decided, like, let's try to get more contributors involved, like through Gitcoin, and there were a few different smaller bounties that he put up. I think it was mostly to do with front-end work, just like cleaning up parts of the UX for the exchange. He mostly sort of came up with this idea on his own after trying a lot of dexes and finding that most of them just didn't have very good UX. But the reason that I think we were able to help Hayden is because we already have a network of developers who want to work with open source software, and then at the same time, we were able to get him funding because people already cared about Hayden's project. They just didn't really have an easy way to donate. So I think those were sort of the two things that that got us involved in Uniswap. We obviously think it's an amazing project. I think it's actually like one of the best DEXs out there. But those were sorts of the sorts of things that we did in his case. Yeah.
I would like to ask, what do you recommend the best way to get sustainable from the developer community? If you are maintaining an open source project, like how to get a donation, if like getting an advertise in your terminal is not appropriate, what is the best way to do that, and how we can make it sustainable, or how we can build up the community?
Thank you. Yeah. That's a very good question. By the way, there'll be a panel later today on developer communities, so I think that'll be a good opportunity to dive more into this question. But in particular, I think there's a lot of opportunity to get people in either the sort of cryptocurrency community through Gitcoin engaged, but there's also ways to get just Web2 developers generally engaged. So for example, like Hacktoberfest is happening right now, actually. So if you have a repo, actually everyone here who has a repo should put up like Hacktoberfest labels on issues that they think people can get involved in. I think that's really the most important step. It's just like a lot of maintainers think, oh, like I'll just like maintain this forever, and I won't bother engaging other contributors. I'll close people's pull requests, which sometimes is necessary. But I think that by engaging those people more frequently, you're able to get those people eventually becoming familiar enough with the repo to become core maintainers. So just like encouraging those people, I think, is a really good first step. In terms of funding, you're always welcome to open up a grant on Gitcoin grants. So it's actually like open to anyone to use. But I would also recommend Open Collective. And Open Collective is for fiat currency. It's mostly US based, but they're expanding globally. And I think they do a really good job of also targeting a different pool of donors to their sort of grants pool than we do. And I would recommend talking to them as well. Cool. Any last questions? Awesome. Thanks so much.